Good morning students. Today I am going to start a new topic, that is using the group by clause with the grouping functions. Now you remember in my earlier presentation I have already discussed about these following aggregate or the grouping functions, that is the sum function, count function, max, mean and the average function. Each of these grouping functions take data of multiple rows as input, perform aggregation on them and then produce a single output. But these grouping functions cannot be used with the where clause. Now consider the two different queries as shown in this slide. In the first query, a grouping function called count has been included along with the where clause. So this query turns out to be the wrong query. This is because as per the rule, no aggregate functions or grouping functions can be included along with the where clause. But if you see the second query, along with the where clause, there are no grouping functions or aggregate functions such as max, mean, count, sum or average. What's included with this where clause is the column called dname, and it's checking whether its value is equal to pen drive or not. So this query turns out to be the correct query. But the query before this, that is this one, which includes the aggregate function called count along with the where clause, turns out to be the wrong query. But you have to note one thing, that don't be confused with the use of the aggregate function called count along with the select operator. In both these queries you can see that they have used the aggregate function called count along with the select operator. But this is possible, this is correct. We can include a grouping or an aggregate function along with the select operator. What we can't do is that we cannot put the aggregate function or the grouping function along with the where clause. So since here I have included the grouping or the aggregate function count along with the where clause, so this query turns out to be the wrong query, whereas this one is the correct query. Now let's start with the group by clause. The group by clause can be used with the grouping functions to perform aggregation by grouping the result set based on the value of a column. Now if you consider this table identified by the name purchase, it consists of 4 different columns, which are SID, DNAME, QTY and PUR date. Now based on this table, there is a question below which is asking us to write a query in MySQL to display the total quantity of devices purchased by each student. Now in order to display the total quantity of devices purchased, we have to make use of this sum function, and that has to be applied on the QTY column, that is this one. But we are not using this sum function to add up all the values of this column called QT1 just like that. This is because we have to group these students first on the basis of their student ID or the SID. This is because if we group the students on the basis of their SID, then for the SID with the value S40, that means the student bearing the SID value as S40, he purchases the device called CD-ROM first on this particular date, that is the year 2013, month 1 and day 26, and on this particular date he has purchased 10 quantities of the device called CD-ROM, and again he has purchased 1 quantity of the device called CD-ROM on a different date, that is in the year 2013, month 9 and day 5. So in total he has purchased 10 plus 1, 11 quantities of the device called CD-ROM. Similarly, for the student bearing the SID value as S30, he has purchased the device called RAM, and that also in 3 quantities on this particular date, that is year 2013, month 12 and day 25. And in the same way, for the students bearing the SID value as S20 and S10, they have also purchased the device called pen drive in 2 quantities and 5 quantities respectively. As a result, for this question, if we are required to display the total quantity of devices purchased by each student, we have to select the column SID and along with that the aggregate column, that is sum of QTY from the table purchase, and then I shall use the group by clause with the column called SID followed by semicolon. As a result, the first column SID and the second column, which uses the aggregate function sum, and when it is applied on the column called QTY, gets displayed on the output table exactly like this. That is the first column showing the SID and the second column showing the sum of QTY, where sum is the aggregate or the grouping function. Now note here, when we use this group by clause on this particular column called SID, then the aggregate function sum shall be imposed on this column called QTY for each value of SID. That means for the SID value of S10, we have to find the aggregate function sum of QTY, and again for the SID value as S20, we again have to find the aggregate function sum of QTY, followed by the SID values S30 and S40, for which we have to find the aggregate function sum of QTY separately. Now for the SID value as S10, if you look in the table purchase, okay, he has brought only one type of device, which is pen drive, and that also in bulk, that is 5 quantities. Okay, and that's why the sum of QTY will be 5, which is listed in the output table like this. For the student bearing the SID value as S20, he has also purchased only one type of device, that is pen drive, and that also in bulk, which is 2 quantities, and so the sum of quantity column will list the value 2 for this particular student, that is with the SID value S20. And again for the SID value as S30, the corresponding sum of QTY value shall be 3. Okay, this is because the particular student bearing the SID value as S30 has purchased only one type of device, that is RAM, and that also in bulk, that is 3 quantities of this device RAM. So in the output table, the sum of quantity lists 3 for this particular student bearing the SID value as S30. But now if you see the student bearing the SID value as S40, he has also purchased only one type of device, that is CD-ROM, but he has purchased the same device twice. At first on the date 2013-126 in 10 quantities, and then on this particular date, that is 2013-95 in 1 quantity. So 10 plus 1 comes to 11. So this particular student bearing the SID value as S40 has purchased 11 quantities of the device called CD-ROM. As a result, for the SID value as S40 in the output table, okay, when the SID value as S40, the sum of QTY value is 11. As a result, when we select SID and sum of QTY from the table purchase, and then if we group it as per the SID value, this is what gets displayed in the output table. And for the columns SID and sum of QTY, these are the entries. Now in this slide, let me show you how to use the having clause along with the group by. The result set returned by the group by clause can be filtered using the having clause. Now if you consider this table identified by the name purchase, consisting of 4 different columns, which are SID, DNAME, QTY and PUR date. This table has duplicate entries of S40 for the column called SID, and again it has duplicate entries of CD-ROM and pen drive for the column called DNAME. So neither SID nor DNAME can become the primary key column for this table purchase. So this table purchase does not have any primary key column which can uniquely identify every record in this table. Now, based on this table, there is a question below which is asking us to write a query in MySQL to display the total number of times that a student had purchased a device from the store if it is more than one. Now let's break this question into two parts. Okay, let's not solve the second part. Okay, let's solve the first part only, that is write a query in MySQL to display the total number of times that a student had purchased a device from the store. So let's stop at this point. We will solve the second part after solving the first part. Now, if we have to display the total number of times that a student had purchased a device from the store, we have to use the count function on the column called DNAME, that is this column. Now that the student bearing the SID value as S10 has purchased the device called pen drive only once, so count of DNAME will return 1 with the student bearing the SID value as S10. Again, for the student bearing the SID value as S20, since he has also purchased this device called pen drive once, so count of DNAME will return 1 even for this student bearing the SID value as S20. Then for the student with SID value as S30, he has also purchased another device called RAM, and that also once. So count of DNAME will return 1 for this particular student bearing the SID value as S30. Now if you see this particular student bearing the SID value as S40, he has also purchased only one type of device called CD-ROM, but he has purchased twice. At first on the date 2013-1/26 when he has brought 10 quantities of the device called CD-ROM, and then again on the date 2013-9/5 where he has brought only 1 quantities of the device called CD-ROM. But he has purchased this device called CD-ROM twice. So count of DNAME, okay, when it is applied for this particular SID, that is S40, will return 2. As a result, we can say that count of DNAME will return 2 for the student bearing the SID value as S40. As a result, if we stop the question at this point, we shall see two different columns, that is SID and count of DNAME, appearing exactly like this in the output table. But the entries for these two columns shall be S10-1, S21. Okay, I repeat, for the SID value as S10, the count of DNAME will be 1. For the SID value as S20, the count of DNAME will also be 1. For the SID value as S30, the count of DNAME shall also be 1. But for the SID value as S40, the count of DNAME shall be 2, because this particular student bearing the SID value as S40 has purchased the device called CD-ROM twice. Now, as per the question, we need to display the total number of times that a student had purchased the device from the store if it is more than 1. Okay, now if we see this table, only for the student bearing the SID value as S40, the total number of times that he has purchased this device called CD-ROM is more than 1, because he has purchased the CD-ROM twice. Okay, that's why only for the SID value as S40, the count of dname has been displayed in the output table, which is 2, as he has purchased this device called CD-ROM twice. So for this question, this is the query. Select SID, count of dname from the table purchase. Then we group by the column called SID. Then we use the having clause, and inside the having clause we specify the aggregate function on the column dname and to check whether it is more than 1. So for that I give the greater than symbol 1 followed by semicolon. So the second part of this question, to check whether it is more than 1, is done with the help of the having clause, and inside this having clause I have used the aggregate function count on the column dname to determine whether the total number of times that a student had purchased the device is more than 1 or not. And from this particular table, since only the student bearing the SID value as S40 has purchased the device called CD-ROM more than once, okay, so only his entry has been displayed in the output table as SID with the value S40 and count of dname with the value 2. Now we can also use the order by clause along with the group by clause. The result set returned by the group by clause can be sorted using the order by clause in the query. Note that the order by clause must appear after the group by clause in the query syntax. Now as you can see here in this particular query, the order by clause is appearing after the group by clause. Now we shall refer the same table called purchase with the column names SID, dname, QTY and PUR date. Now based on this table, there is a question below which is asking us to write a query in MySQL to display the minimum quantity of device purchased by each student in descending order of their ID. Now if we are required to display the minimum quantity of device purchased by each student, okay, we have to use the min aggregate function, okay, to be applied on the QTY column, that is this column. Now from this query, based on this question, which lists the column SID and the mean of the QTY column from the table purchase, it lists the minimum quantity, okay, for each of the student IDs, that is S10, S20, S30 and S40 in the descending order of their ID. And for presenting the minimum quantity of devices purchased by each student in the descending order of their ID, I shall include this order by clause which shall be imposed on the column called SID, and then I shall use this keyword, that is DESC, okay, to print the minimum quantities of device purchased by each student in descending order in the output table. Now let me repeat. If you are asked to display the minimum quantity of device purchased by each student in descending order of their ID, then you shall use the min aggregate function or the min grouping function on the column called QTY, that is this particular column. So you have to select the SID column along with this column called min of QTY from the table purchase, and then you have to group by the column called SID so that you can print the minimum quantity of devices for each student on the basis of their SID values, that is S10, S20, S30 or S40, and then display this column along with their entries into the output table in the descending order of SID, okay, that is at first from the SID value S40 followed by S30, then S20 and then S10. So in the output table, you can see the SID value S40 appearing first. And for the SID value as S40, the minimum quantity of devices purchased is 1, because out of 1 and 10 for the SID value as S40, the minimum quantity will be 1. That's why mean of quantity or mean of the column called QTY returns 1 out of the values 1 and 10 from the QTY column. That's why in the output table you can see the first record as S40 for SID and 1 for mean of QTY. Then for the SID value as S30, the mean of QTY value will be 3 only. This is because there is only one value for QTY, which is 3. And again, if you have to find out the mean of QTY for the single value called 3, it will be 3 itself. The same will be the case for SID value as S20 and S10. For them, since they have the QTY value as 2 and 5 respectively, so the mean of QTY value should also be 2 and 5 respectively. As a result, for the columns SID and mean of QTY in the output table, these are the corresponding entries. Now you can see clearly here, just after the inclusion of this DESC keyword, after the order by clause imposed on the column called SID, we are able to display the values corresponding to this SID column, starting from the largest, which is S40, followed by the second largest, which is S30, followed by S20, and then the smallest, which is S10. And with this I end my presentation here, and that's all for today.